Hi, it's Sean, and you're listening to The 3-Month Vacation. My wife Renuka has always loved the rain, but not anymore. It all came down to a single event. In the summer of 2023, we had had almost 7 months of nonstop rain. It had started in May and continued right through the rest of the year. In January, it was still bucketing down in torrents. However, this particular storm wasn't just passing through. It lingered overhead for hours. At first, the water accumulated in the garden and we were excited. We took pictures. We even took some videos. However, as the water level kept rising, we started to worry. After an hour, the garden was filled with water. It rose to the level of the steps, then above that level, and finally, it was like we were marooned in our own house. There was a moat around us, and we had no idea when or whether it would stop raining. This event caused Renuka to feel a certain amount of anxiety. The storm had left such a scary imprint that even the smallest amount of precipitation would give her the jitters. It has been a year and a bit since that storm. Renuka no longer has anxiety about the rain. The pain that she felt has been minimized. Because the storms didn't recur, it wasn't an ongoing pain. Once that pain had enough time to heal, it disappeared. The excitement of a rainy day is back. Something similar happens when we initiate the learning process for our clients. Clients start out most learning with excitement. Then they hit the first storm and then they feel stressed out. Suddenly, the learning experience has turned into a series of storms. These storms recur with furious intensity, creating a permanent pain map in the learner's brain. Learning then becomes an edgy experience. It rattles the learners. They feel unsafe. They don't feel confident for most of the time. However, learning shouldn't be that way. It should be a fun experience and never painful. What causes this pain map, and how can we as trainers overcome these stormy situations? In this episode, we'll look at 3 slightly unusual areas that cause pain and how we as teachers can prevent that pain map from occurring at all. The 3 elements that we're going to cover are 1. The loneliness of learning. 2. Why deconstruction is more crucial than just another assignment. And finally, why it's more important to pace learning than just to steam right ahead. Let's start out with the first one, which is the loneliness of learning. I was in Spain participating in a watercolor workshop, and it seemed like everyone seemed to know what to do. They set up their easel, they knew how to prime their paper, and all of them seemed to have an array of brushes. Me, I was just standing around looking like a royal doofus. This feeling of being inadequate is common among all learners. The primary reason why we go to a class or do a course is because we need to improve our skill. We also need to feel confident that we can not only understand, but we can apply that learning to some degree. Yet, the moment we step into a learning situation, it feels like going back to school. What's so bad about going back to school, you may ask? Think about how you did any test or exam at school. You were given the questions, you had to answer them. So far, so good. But if you didn't know a lot about the subject matter, it would feel like everybody else was somehow confident. You look around the room and everybody was tackling their work, and you didn't think that your stuff was just as good. You felt like a doofus. Not just a doofus, but a royal doofus. That's when things went from bad to worse. You finished your paper, you submitted your test, and only the teacher was allowed to see what you had submitted. You weren't allowed to look at how the others tackled the very same assignment. Every student in school is treated like an island. No one gets to see the work of others. No one gets to learn from each other. We start out feeling slightly not so confident, and then we reach a level of pain. It makes us feel like we're doing something wrong, when in reality, it's the system. The system is out of whack. This is why one of the most important goals is to create a safe learning space. But how do you create this safe space? You take the loneliness out of learning by creating a group. This group isn't some newfangled phrase called cohort learning. You're not just lumping a whole bunch of people together and making them fend for themselves. Instead, your job as a trainer is to get about 5 to 7 people to know each other exceedingly well. In a live workshop, this may take a lot of time. You may need to have a meet and greet the night before. You might need to go to dinner. The next day, you may need to spend at least 2 hours in some activity that has absolutely nothing to do with what you're teaching. If it's an online course, you might need to have a low-risk, super easy set of assignments. Not for 1 day, not for 2 days, but for an entire week. This allows the group to quickly finish their work and go around getting to know each other. In fact, part of your job as a trainer is to get them to mingle, is to get them to feel comfortable in a group. They need to understand each other's personality, the tone. They need to learn a bit about what the other person does for a living and how they live their lives. None of this activity is focused on what you're teaching. None of it is about the skill itself. And whether you're teaching cooking or copywriting, the goal should always be to create the little group silos. In a psychotactics course, for example, we may start out with 20 clients, but then we further segregate them into groups of 4 or 5. Sometimes it goes up to 7. It's not as if we've always followed this method. When we first started out, we were happy to call the big group a group. We'd throw 20 people together in one big segment and say, hey, this is group learning. Of course, the bigger the crowd, the more lonely and terrified the learner is likely to feel. They don't get to know anyone, and that's because there is no clear segregation, there is no silo, and you're just there, one person in the room, completely isolated. Learning is about being in a safe space first and last. One of the reasons why I felt so isolated in that watercolor class is because I didn't know anyone. But if I'd spent the night before drinking sangria and eating tapas, I might have acted differently. Instead of being a deer in the headlights, I would have turned to a friend and instantly been able to move ahead. Furthermore, when the group started to work on a project, it would not end up being a state secret. I would see how the others tackled the assignment, and that would get me quickly out of my funk zone. Most importantly, I'd have realized that everyone was in the same leaky boat. They were all beginners. They were all learning the skill, and I would have not felt this doofus halo on my head. When we learn, we build a map of pain. If we progress quickly through the early stages, we feel emboldened. However, if we are alone and expected to figure out steps in our journey, we almost certainly fall into the gutter. And why not? We join a course because we are hopeless at something. We don't join because we are already spectacular at that skill, which is why the group must be put together, the group must be small and well selected. Instead of a pain map, what we develop is a fun map. We feel like coming back to learn. We feel excited by the progress that we're making, which means that creating and getting group members to work together is the starting point of any learning program. It's time to move to the deep end, right? Not really. Learning doesn't have to be hard and shouldn't be, especially at the very beginning. Things need to go slow. And part of this slow process is the second concept, which is a concept called deconstruction. I'm writing a novel, said the woman sitting beside me in the restaurant. We were on holiday, and at breakfast we started talking to the guests at the adjoining table. I'm writing a book, said the woman. I nodded. I asked her about the book. I said, do you have a villain? What's a villain? She asked. I explained that a novel or any story doesn't have legs until it turns into a problem. Hence, if there's a hero to the story, there needs to be a villain. Once she heard my comment, she was pretty energized. I'm going back to my room after breakfast. I'm going to add a villain, she said. I think it's a bad idea, I said softly. I told her that the next step would be to read 10 or 20 books and look for the villain. When does the villain show up? How much damage does he create? How does the hero overcome the problem? Your next task, I said to her, isn't to write, but rather to read. In other words, her brief was to deconstruct. As trainers, one of our main tasks is getting people to complete an assignment. If you are teaching something, like maybe how to cook, you may want them to immediately start the dish. Yet everyone who learns something new is completely at sea. Just like I was unsure about what to do in that watercolor class in Spain, the learner isn't sure what move to make next. The next move shouldn't be to build anything, but rather to take things apart. The woman who was writing the novel didn't need to write anything. Instead, she needed to read. She needed to listen or even watch. She needed a very low-stress activity, and it would still feel like she was making a lot of progress. This low-stress deconstruction activity is crucial because it helps to avoid creating that pain map. When learning just about anything, we create a series of pain points. We stumble over the most minor hurdle, and then we see ourselves as not good enough. When we join a course or any training session, we do so because we need some system, yet the system is often poorly designed. Instead of getting the learner to do something, we have to get them to recognize the pattern and then deconstruct it. I'll give you an example. In the storytelling course at Psychotactics, the clients don't necessarily launch into writing stories. Instead, they're given a concept called ups and downs. They're told that a story isn't a story until it has its challenges and possibly some winning moments. These are the ups and downs. Then, instead of writing stories, they simply read a story or they watch a video. They're in deconstruction mode. They get to see the pattern, they get to analyze when things are going well and when they're not. However, there is little or no pain involved in the assignment. Without pain, the pain map doesn't increase. On the other hand, if they're constantly thrown in the deep end and you're told, write a story, finish your assignment, do your homework, well, that's instant anxiety. The pain map isn't hard to create, and most learning takes away the joy. It just gets ripped apart and gets replaced with fear and anxiety. Deconstruction is the way to go, but it's not the only way. The first thing that we have to do is we have to get those groups together. Once people are in a group of 5 to 7 people, they can see what the others have done, they can comment on it, they can praise the work. Essentially, you've made friends. And it's in this friendly atmosphere that they're called upon to just look at something and deconstruct it. It's a low-stress activity. So is it time to speed up things? No, not at all. This is where pacing comes into play, and it takes us to the third part, which is why it's crucial to pace learning. I once heard a fascinating bit of information from a neuroscientist. According to her research, we can only absorb a limited amount of information per day. This information is stored in our short-term memory, which is then transferred into long-term memory as we sleep. But even the transfer is fraught with hurdles. If we don't sleep well enough or long enough, there is a fair bit of dropout in the transfer process. When a client learns something, there's a good chance that they have a high dropout rate. Because it's impossible to measure dropout of any kind, let's take a chance. Let's adopt an irrationally high dropout figure. Let's say that the client has 100% of information and they've only transferred 10% of that information from short-term to long-term memory. So if we move at snail's pace and we're looking at 10% today, 10% tomorrow, 10% the day after, and we're being quite optimistic here, then at the end of the week, they've only completed 50% of that information. If the syllabus is badly designed, then what you'll find is you're doing subject matter A this week, and then you move to subject matter B on the next week. We were optimistic in saying that the client learned about 50%. But even if they were top-notch and learned about 50%, that leaves a big gap of the other 50%. When the learning is incomplete, the learner always has a feeling of being lost. There's an uneasy sensation of being in catch-up mode. Yet this problem can be eased if pace is integral to the teaching process. When conducting courses, we find that clients may struggle a bit as the week progresses. Saturday comes in and so does Sunday, and when they come back the next week, they are tackling the same subject matter. They don't have to move briskly ahead. But you notice something completely different. The people that were slightly uncomfortable in the first week are more confident. Nothing changed. There were no instructions. There was no homework. But there was this relaxation over the weekend. Somehow all of that information consolidated, and now they're ready to move forward. As you can see, it's not the syllabus that's a problem. It's the instructional design that's not in place. If your design considers that people don't remember much of what they learn, you will assume that they'll get to just 50%, maybe even lower, in the first week. You will also understand that no one makes it to 100%. And even by the end of the second week, they still are not quite there. But there is an additional space, and that space keeps them in the safe zone. Shouldn't you then allow a third week to learn the concept even better? Much of what you're teaching depends on the time you have at your disposal. Plus, a third week of doing the same thing can lead to a different kind of pain, namely boredom. So how do you tackle this problem and get people to move ahead stage by stage? Let's look at the progress using an alphabet chart. In week 1, we tackle A1. In week 2, we continue on that A subject matter, but we go to the next stage, which is A2. So in those 2 weeks, we've only covered one topic. In week 3, we do a little bit of A1, A2, and then we add B1. And then in week 4, as you'd expect, we have A1, A2, B1, B2. And so all of this happens in layers. When there is this slow-paced method, there's a constant level of layering. Most learning happens very slowly. So it might take 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks before the client is able to understand and implement the idea very confidently. But more importantly, they don't feel as much pain. It's easy to see how people can be talented in almost any field, provided the instructional design is well executed. It's important to understand that all pain is real. Even if the pain is in your head, the brain makes no distinction between structural pain or any other pain. However, most of our learning problems occur from terrible teaching structures. It's why we buy one course, then jump to another and another. It's not that we have the attention span of a butterfly. Instead, all of this jumping around is because the instructional design is based on an information dump. Instead of paying attention to how the brain processes and implements things, we are simply faced with endless information. Information is painful, it's tiring too. That's why your kid isn't always a fan of learning, and it's why clients struggle through most learning as well. Pain can be reduced, especially at the starting stage, and that starting stage, that's the most difficult of all. Are these the only way to reduce the pain map of learning? Not at all. Many steps are needed to make the journey more fun for the learner. However, these 3 steps alone will make a considerable difference in reducing the pain of learning. Let's summarize, shall we? The first aspect is the loneliness of learning. Just having some fancy names for groups doesn't make it a group learning session. The group has to be carefully selected. It has to be a group of not more than 5 to 7 people, not less as well. They have to get to know each other. There have to be activities, either offline or online, that enable them to mingle, and that's how they feel comfortable and safe. Just slapping, hey, this is a group session, doesn't make it a group. If anything, it makes it more scary to be part of a huge group. It's like going to a party and there are 70 people there or 30 people. But even if there are just 15 people, you're just by yourself because you don't know anybody. That's the first thing. The second is deconstruction. When you start off teaching somebody, you don't have to get them to do any assignments. Instead, you can have them look at something that somebody else did, maybe a dish that somebody else cooked. Once they know what to look for, they can just deconstruct. They can say, hey, the cinnamon is missing, or this got burnt, or this happened or that happened. Deconstruction is a really easy way to go about creating a pattern, but not the pain. And what it also does is it allows the group to settle in and to get to know each other. Finally, it's very crucial to understand that it takes so much time to learn. In the first week, you might have just 50% of whatever is being taught to you. And that's if you're lucky. And that's if there is a slow-paced system in place. By the end of the second week, you're not going to get to 100%. You might get to 100% 3 or 4 weeks later. So all of this has to be taken into consideration. And it's only when you do at least these 3 things that you don't form that pain map that most learners feel. All of us get into learning with a sense of excitement. We want to learn to play the guitar. We want to learn how to write. We want to learn how to dance. But then immediately things seem to go wrong. And that is because of instructional design. So what should you do today? The first thing that you can do is to just look at how you can get somebody to deconstruct something. So assemble a few things, like maybe if you're doing a storytelling course, let them look at 3 or 4 other stories or other videos and just deconstruct. And that you can do this week because they can look at other people's work and quite happily criticize it. And that's it. That's where you can start. And this brings us to the end of the podcast. What's happening in Psychotactics land? Well, we're going to Paris, France, and that's at the end of November. We're going to have just 6 people in a strategy session. 4 of those seats are already gone, 2 are left. You want to come because it's 3 days of spending time with me and those 5 other people who are going to be there. So that's the first thing. The second thing is we're going to have a meetup at the end of November, again in Paris, France. And you're going to see how a meetup at Psychotactics is completely different from anything you've been to. Sometimes it starts in the morning and then goes on for the afternoon, and, well, you should allocate time. Not because you can't leave, but because people linger and they're having such a good time. If you want to just get inspired and even take some information back home so that you can implement it, then make the trip, especially if you live in Europe and you're about 3 or 4 hours away. Make this trip because you'll find that it is reasonably life-changing. Yes, it's just a meetup, but you'll see how different it is. In fact, we have a very high recurring rate of people who show up to the meetups. So at least 50% of the people have been to many meetups before. That's how much fun it is. We'll see you in Paris, France, or we'll see you at the membership site in 5000 BC. Bye for now.